Folks, welcome to World 2020, the Orange Cyber Defense Global Leadership Virtual Conference. This is, of course, virtual, as many conferences are at the moment, but no less fun and engaging for that. My name is Jeff White. I'm an investigative journalist covering tech. I'm the author of this book, crime.com, available in all good bookshops. And I'm going to be guiding you through some of the sessions today. There's a packed agenda going on until 20 to 2 European time and 20 to 1 UK time. We're going to dive straight in and get started with our first panel, where we really have got the A-team of Orange Cyber Defense speakers to talk to us. We're going to be looking at the threat, the technological and geopolitical trends that are shaping the current cybersecurity landscape and affecting decisions that are made at a board level. So I'm going to introduce our panelists who are, quite frankly, the A-team, really, of Orange Cyber Defense. We have Nicolas Arpesian, who is Vice President of Strategy and Public Affairs. We have Charles van der Walt, who is Head of Security Research Centre. We have Etienne Grief, who's Group Chief Technical Officer. And we have Dominic White, who's Ethical Hacking Group Director. And we have Robinson Delagere, who is Head of Computer Security Incident Response Team. So I'm going to go firstly to Charles, if I may, because I'm interested, there's a model that you've got for cybersecurity involving climate change. I'm quite interested in that model, how you've evolved it and how the one thing relates to the other. Perhaps you could kick us off, Charles.
Jeff, hi, and thanks, and hello, everyone. Yeah, so, you know, obviously a business like ours, it's part of our mission to understand what's going on in the threat landscape, not only today, but also in the near future and perhaps in the not so near future. You know, I think as people would have gleaned from our theme for this year, we seek to develop and apply a model which in our mind is similar to a climate model. And like a climate model, it's not perfect, but it tries to capture, you know, the key things, the major factors that shape the weather in, you know, one or the other geography today, tomorrow, and maybe, you know, a few months from now. And so we call it our emerging threat model. And like a climate model, it consists of a number of layers. And if you like, there's 4 contributing layers and 1 emergent layer. The emergent layer is obviously the various threats that eventually manifest because of the other, if you like, contributing layers, which are the systemic factors that work together, that shape each other to create the threats and the vulnerabilities that we all have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And really, the way we think about it, if we kind of play with that climate idea, is that there are a set of drivers, we call them the geopolitical drivers, which you can think of as like the climate conditions that create energy in a system. That's where the problem, if you like, originally comes from. Think of it as like major high pressure and low pressure systems in the climate model. Next in our model, we have what we call the structural factors. Those are, if you like, these are factors or environmental factors that shape that energy. They may slow it down, they may speed it up, they may direct the energy in one way or the other. And I'll dive into each of these layers with a little bit more detail in a moment. But those structural factors, they give shape to that energy. The legacy factors, which is the third layer of our model, are things that tend to be immutable in the landscape. They don't change very often. These are things that, you know, we experienced to be true yesterday, that we're seeing them to be true today, and we anticipate that they'll be true tomorrow. And for the most part, these factors they're accelerators. They speed the problem up. They make the problem worse. And you can think of them as, if you like, the laws of physics or the laws of the built-in or the human behavior or the built environment. So, for example, you know, we know in climate that we're dealing with things like, you know, hot air rises or the Coriolis force. And those things, in our model, we refer to those as legacy factors, and we believe they've got equivalence in the technology and security space. And then the last layer before the actual threat emerges is what we call the evolution of technology, which are, you can think of sort of as the impact that human activity has on the climate. So whereas the legacy factors generally don't change, the technology factors, we believe, really do change quite frequently. And as technology changes, we can anticipate that the emerging threat model will change also. And so just to summarize that, we believe that the geopolitical drivers create energy, the structural factors shape that energy, the legacy factors accelerate it, and the evolution of technology disperses or diffuses the problem. And what we end up with is this emergent threat landscape with the various threats that we track. So if I dive into each of those levels, I mentioned the political drivers already. So these are things that we believe create at a very fundamental level the problem that we're dealing with. And we think of them as akin to the sort of high pressure and low pressure systems in the climate model. They include things in our model like the investment by governments in offensive cyber operations, so basically investing in computer hacking. On the one hand, on the other hand, government efforts to protect civilian cyberspace, international treaties and regulations, and then things like the balkanization of cyberspace, so the way we see the various governments pulling apart and isolating themselves from the rest of the internet. Those would all be examples of geopolitical drivers. In terms of the structural factors, here we would look at things like national and regional regulations, the level to which company boards feel themselves accountable for cybersecurity, the continued skills gap in cyber, along with what we perceive to be a leadership gap in cybersecurity. And then, of course, from the criminal side, from the cybercrime side, the constant innovation by cyber criminals. These are all factors that shape that problem into what we see today. In terms of legacy, here we look at things like what we would call fundamental internet weak spots. So these are things that are fundamentally baked into the underlying architecture of the internet and the web that just continue to cause problems. The difficulties we have with passwords, just the fundamental fallibility of passwords as a form of identifying, authenticating people. The ongoing challenges we have with vulnerability management, understanding which systems we've got, understanding where their vulnerabilities are and actually getting to patch them. The psychological predisposition of users to fall for scams and lures, we would count under legacy factors, and so on and so forth. And then finally, we look, as I said, at the evolution of technology as a factor that diffuses the problem and sort of splits it up into various threads. And on this level, we don't just look at specific technologies, but also at the principles with which technologies emerge, or the laws that we can hold to be true when new technologies do emerge. So, for example, we believe that when you progress, when you introduce a new technology, you're typically building on legacy. Classic example would be IoT. When somebody introduces a new IoT product, we know that actually it rides on an old Linux operating system. And so it's not actually that's not so new. And so when, as technology evolves, we believe the old challenges persist, and that the new technology generally increases the attack surface and tends to make the problem bigger. And so with those principles in mind, we're tracking, at this level, we're tracking things like cloud, clearly, in the way it adds complexity, the notion of agility and DevOps and how that stretches our kind of current security paradigms, the way IoT and things like 5G multiply the security threat, and of course, slightly more down the road issues like the impact that artificial intelligence may have. And then finally, from those 4 layers in our model, we then sort of once a year get together, as a bit of a mind hive, and we consider what we believe the sort of dominant trends are going to be in the year to come. And if I look back to what we said at the beginning of this year, that includes things like the democratization of targeting. So the notion that everyone is a target, everyone can be attacked, because frankly, from the attacker's point of view, every compromise provides opportunities for monetization. We also believed at the beginning of this year that the supply chain would be attacked, just because the immense opportunity it gives the attacker to scale from one place. We believe that as factories and various systems became more automated, that we would see more attacks against ICS, industrial control systems, and operational technology. We thought there would be more attacks against managed services provider. It didn't take a crystal ball, but I'm proud to say that we predicted and speculated about how ransom and extortion attacks would grow, along with the fact that data leaks would grow. And finally, we expected to see more attacks focused on mobile devices, particularly with the view to bypassing multi-factor authentication systems as those became more and more common. And so just to wrap that up, Jeff, the model allows us not only to think in a structured way about what's happening in the security landscape, but also to think holistically, to make sure that we're looking at all the factors, political, economic, psychological, etc. And then finally, it allows us to hold ourselves accountable and to make ourselves accountable to the people that we talk with. And we make it our business to track each one of these elements in our data sets using what we call trend markers. So we have a fairly good idea of where we were right, where we missed things, and where we can perhaps adjust our models going forward.
Really interesting. Just before we move on quickly, obviously there's a difference between weather and climate, has been pointed out many times. Obviously the weather's a sort of short-term thing and the climate's a sort of longer-term thing. And obviously with the climate models that people use, the further out you get, the further into the future you get, the less the model can really be a predictor. Is it similar in this case, in that this is a long-term, long-range thing you're looking at, and actually the longer range you get, the harder it is to make more solid predictions, I suppose?
Absolutely. I don't think we have that much faith in our ability to see into the future. And actually, now that you mentioned it, one of the things that we track in our model is what we call the miscellaneous trend markers, which are the things that we missed, the things that we just never saw coming. And a classic example this year, which is really a really good example of a systemic factor, was COVID. Nobody saw that. Nobody had any way of seeing it in cyberspace or predicting what its impact would be. And there are others. I'll leave it to some of my colleagues to mention them, but there are others that we missed. But at least because we have a model that's transparent and structured, we can go back and note those things and adjust our model accordingly, which is how any model gets better, I think.
Yeah. Good stuff. Well, let's dig into this a little bit. Each of the speakers, I think, is going to take one of those chunks and talk about it. Let's come to Nicola first of all. I mean, the geopolitical factors that Charles has talked about. Can you talk us through what the game changers are there, what the critical ones among those are?
Hi, everyone. Yes, exactly as Charles said, we can see today that cyber is at the center of the geopolitical discussions. Why? Because all the countries, big and the larger countries, included in their military arsenal the cyber weapon, the capacity to take information to other countries, to keep and remain secret information. And we see that we have obviously investment in human competences, in equipment, in software, and this is part of the global geopolitics. Why? Because, for instance, we can see when the USA want to fight against China, they are using that subject, and we can see now a Chinese officer on the list of the most wanted criminals of the FBI, which was historically a list limited to the criminal to the criminals. And we see that they are using that subject to fight against each other. For instance, even the very peaceful Europe is using in its legal body the question of cyber and say, okay, we will sue countries or individuals when we can suffer cyber attacks. And then they wrote legal text specifically dedicated to cybersecurity, beside the one concerning national security and the classic way of protecting national assets and national strategic interest.
In terms of that, obviously you've looked at nation states there. What about the private sector and private industry? How do they feed into this geopolitical area?
But of course, in the same way, then when you know that by having some business information, a kind of economic advantage, you can it's good for states and for national interest to have that kind of information. And then we see that. And we see that phenomenon in all the countries. I mean, in Europe, in the US, in Asia, in Russia, even in Africa, where there is now a legal body which is built and is stronger every day. We can see that we have specific sanctions, and for instance, concerning the text saying, okay, if you are facilitating ransomware payments, you will be able to be sued. And why? Because in fact, we have the technical side, a question about the software, the ransomware, and all the malware industry. But all this industry is financed and supported by very classic and very conventional financial activities. So we can see that there is a mix between the very classic business like finance, like storage of data, like connections between countries and continents, and the fact that we need to have these very specific rules. I take the example of the fact that in the US specific legislation, and there are now, I would say, a strong one and without link to any presidency. And obviously, the coming president will keep and remain keep that kind of legislation to see that purchasing data from illicit sources is something that you can be responsible of. So it means that we can see that the law now is starting to cover every step of the cybercrime activity, from dealing ransomwares to using data taken by using some very criminal software. So at the end, the business is fully concerned because its responsibility can be engaged. And the fact is that even the very financial SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, on the stock market, they say, okay, once you suffered cyber attack, you have to be able to justify that you did what was needed to be well protected in that circumstances. So it means that the financial guy are very interested to talk about cybersecurity. The legal guy are very involved on that field. So it means that it's absolutely something which is to concern everyone in the executive committee. We have to give information to that to the financial community, to investors or to stakeholders or shareholders.
And presumably another chunk of this is legislation, regulation, isn't it, from different areas? We've seen the sort of mega legislations like GDPR. Presumably that's another of the building blocks in this geopolitical area.
Yes, because with GDPR, we fixed a price to privacy, to data. If you have a leak, if you lost data, okay, you can be fined. And the fact that the fine is limited up to 4% of the worldwide turnover, you see, we are talking about big amount of money. And so that's why the investors are saying, okay, what are the question on cybersecurity in my company? And we see that the rating agencies like Moody's, like Standards & Poor's decided to say, okay, we have our financial criteria, we have our legal criteria, we have our human resources and social responsibility, but all that is very well. But if we can't guarantee any cybersecurity standards, maybe that business activity is quite weak. And so because we have information, but if we can lose it, if we have we can be sued on behalf of this, for instance, legislation, privacy. You have all these contexts saying, okay, now the stock market is very interested to have information, to have guarantees concerning the cybersecurity capacity of companies from any business sector.
Do you think, just lastly, do you think that it's interesting stuff, the regulation stuff. We've also seen in terms of legal action, a lot from the US, a lot of big indictments against China, against North Korea, against Russian players, Russian actors, threat actors. Do you think we're going to see more of those, big indictments, big criminal complaints that came out, not just from the US, but maybe from other countries as well?
Yes, because the companies will need to have someone responsible at the end. When you have big amount of losses, when you can't hide the fact that you were under attack. Someone say, okay, who is responsible? Call me the boss. Who is in charge? And so that's why we see that subcontractors, suppliers will be asked about their level of cybersecurity. What did you do to protect myself? Did you represent a threat to my organization? And we can see that in the contracts, the question of giving information about your cybersecurity capacity is something which is very, very important because in fact, okay, there is no difficulty to admit that now companies are interconnected and they are working together on large grids. But okay, I don't want to work with someone that can be the weak part of the structure. So the question is that we have to be able to be quite clear, quite transparent about what was done to protect digital assets and the capacity to detect and the capacity to react and then to be in a way resilient at the end if something can't be avoided and if an attack can be stopped.
Interesting stuff. Thanks for that, Nicolas. Really, really interesting overview of that part. Let's skip on to the legacy factors. Dominic, I want to come to you now. In terms of those legacy factors that Charles talked about, what are some examples and how do they feed into the threat landscape?
So, I mean, what we spend our time doing is exploiting those legacy factors. So it's a very interesting question, and I like the climate model. And because I think what's interesting about humans or humanity's influence on weather is that our structures that we build to house ourselves, to put cities in, we don't think it's going to have an impact on weather, but it ends up having an impact on weather. So if sort of look at the impact of cities on hurricanes or tornadoes, you've got this heat rising from the cities and it ends up changing the weather around it. So I think there's some similarity there to the way we've structured our networks, we've structured our authentication. And one of the things that I find, well, there's two interesting differences from weather, so deviating from Charles' model. So the first is, I think when there's a disaster, a weather disaster, there's a great response at a sort of systemic level. So if you take building codes in response to earthquakes, people learn the lesson from the earthquake and they improve the way we build our buildings to limit impact of damage from later on. But when you look at the impact from cyber disasters or cyber incidents, what you have is a very localized response. So if you take something like the SWIFT attacks that started happening around 2016, I mean, by 2016, for years, the payment card industry had the data security standard in place. Now, knowing that cyber fraud happens, that payment systems are going to be used to conduct it, is something that shouldn't be news to any of us. But the PCI DSS was a response to a whole bunch of credit card cyber fraud. And then years later, SWIFT put their customer security program in place. Technically, we knew about this disaster, but we didn't put the building codes in place to try and protect us. So we have this very localized response a lot of the time to our disasters. And funny enough, the CSP is probably an example of a non-localized response. I think a lot of the rest of the time, it's up to the organization that was compromised. You know, the joke is go do your banking with the last bank that was compromised because they'll probably have the best security for the next year. Mm-hmm. And then I think there's a couple of reasons why this happens. And the first is that I think structures influence the weather, as we've said, but the structures that we've built are based on sort of precepts or design precepts that we believe. And in cyber, those are called best practices. And the truth that most of your hackers will tell you is that best practices are either lying to you or, in the best case, maybe misleading you. And there's a perfect example that I love using. In every report that we will write, the first finding will be missing patches. And the first line on best practices is that you must get patch management right. If you ask, what are the top 3 tips that you can recommend to stay cyber secure, we'll apply all your patches. And at an organization level, if you're hitting 99% patch compliance for a security patch, you're actually doing very well. Mm-hmm. At a hacking level, you need one missing patch to actually compromise things. You could actually describe the art of hacking as finding the one place that patch is missing. So if the whole point of hacking is to find the one place that's missing, and you're doing really well in patching if only one place is missing it, then patching is not an effective response to hacking. You know, sure, it reduces the number of places you can look, but you know, there's a weird cognitive dissonance here that doesn't sort of seem to take it. And I'll give you an example. One of our clients, very mature client, they put in quite a comprehensive response to the Eternal Blue vulnerability, MS 17010. And you know, that was WannaCry, not Petya, took out a lot of things. So if you ever needed a reason to patch, that's it. You know, Microsoft released an out-of-band patch for XP. So when we went looking for this thing, we didn't find any of those vulnerabilities. What we found instead was a vulnerability in Cold Fusion that could be exploited to effectively give us the same thing. And then we ended up pivoting around doing the same stuff. So what was the point of fixing MS 17010 if there was other vulnerabilities? And there is obviously a point, but the way attackers aren't like weather is that they can adapt to your defenses, where weather generally doesn't.
Just let's move on. I mean, legacy factors, probably one of the big legacy factors is passwords, and also things like Active Directory and so on. How do they feed into this legacy issue? Well, you know, if you look at IT in the 1980s, particularly in the big corporates, it was very mainframe based. And if you look at people's plans for 2021, it's very cloud based. And we've got this belief of in progress, and you know, Etienne will tell us what he thinks about cloud, but there's this belief in progress that we've moved from mainframes to cloud. But the reality is that's not true. When you look, there's a fascinating case study with, it's maybe a bit cheeky, but ING tried to remove their mainframes. And there's this article on, I think it's the Register, says, you know, bank boss wants to remove mainframes. And it's sort of referred to as a bit of a joke in the mainframe community, because if you scroll down to the bottom, the bank boss is admitting that it's a hell of a job and we're probably not going to get it done. Years later, ING still got their mainframes in place. So the reality is we don't end up moving our IT, we end up stratifying it. So the mainframes are still there. We just built everything around it since then. And the move to cloud is going to be more layers on top of all of that. Now, what that means is the attack surface area available for attackers is only ever increasing. And then attackers' ability to understand things only gets richer as they pull that technology apart. So on two levels, you end up losing. And I'll give you a great example. So we were looking at mainframes for a big mainframe client, and we put together a threat model. You know, what are all the ways that you could attack this? Because we weren't too familiar with mainframes. Within 45 minutes, and it sounds like a boast, but it's not a boast about our capability. I think it's a boast about the reality of mainframes. In 45 minutes, we found a vulnerability which turned out to impact every application exposed over this TM3270 emulation protocol. But we also found out that last year, IBM eventually made a response to, at a systemic level, they introduced an IDS to try and detect this thing. And what was fascinating about that is mainframes have been around for years and they're super secure. You know, how did this vulnerability still exist? Well, it still exists because no one found it and no one had taken the time to look at it, but it was too easy to find. And it sort of speaks to this problem that, you know, vulnerabilities in mainframes, vulnerabilities in Active Directory, new vulnerabilities in cloud end up increasing your total exposure. That's interesting. So I mean, it's a slightly terrifying picture you've painted, but also the ING mainframe example is really interesting. Are we just stuck with these legacy factors then? Are they changeable? And if so, how easy are they to change?
I mean, if they were easy to change, we would have done it, right? So no, not easy to change, and I don't envy anyone in that position. What I do think it's possible to change, though. So if you imagine you know, the surface area that is exposed by your organization, the response then is not how do we patch all of our vulnerabilities so that surface area is lessened, but how do we actually remove surface area from the consideration? And in the security world, that's phrased as how do we remove classes of vulnerabilities? So how do we move to the cloud without keeping our Active Directory and mainframe and every other application we've ever built as a consideration in addition to the cloud? And truthfully, I think the uncomfortable answer there is you need to take brave architectural decisions and choices that aren't easy to do. And the places where this have been successful, there are places where it's been successful. So if you look in the world of mobile, I mean, the difference between your average mobile phone and your average computer is quite fundamental, the level of vulnerability that's exposed. People like Apple and Google made a brave choice to as the freedom lovers amongst us would say, cripple our devices and, remove our ability to tinker with them. But it actually dramatically reduced the surface area available to attack for the average user. So how can you make those kind of shifts in your organization? If you look at the average development framework these days, it won't let you write a SQL injection. That is a class of vulnerabilities that you shouldn't really be introducing into new development environments if you've moved off of stuff. So it is possible to make those moves, but it's not going to just happen by itself. I think you need CISOs making brave architectural decisions, being able to justify those sort of decisions to the business, and then security engineers doing the hard work to make the reduction in surface area true.
Fascinating stuff. Right. Okay. Time to move on to the next bit of the model, the evolution of technology, as Charles talked about. I'm going to be talking to Etienne now about that. These are the actions that humans take that can have an impact on the climate and therefore the weather, the human actions. What are the key technology elements that Orange Cyber Defense is tracking, and what's their impact on the security landscape? Etienne, can you fill us in?
Of course, Jeff. Thanks very much. So Jeff, I think one of the things that we realize as we track these things is that it's difficult to predict the future. And as Charles said, we sometimes try to, we get it right most of the time, sometimes we get it wrong. But what I tend to say is that I'd rather focus on the things that I know won't change than the things that will change. It's much easier to do that. And to an extent, Dom talked about some of that already, the legacy threats. But the reality is that with climate change and geopolitical forces, structural forces, all these fundamental forces, there's some fundamental issues that remain. And the fundamental issues are still around applications. Yes, they may be stratified, they may be running in the cloud. It's known exploits, patching, as Dom pointed out about the patching reports. There's an issue about understanding where your IT infrastructure runs, where your data lives. The fact that very often our networks, although they might be running in different places, there's little barriers between them. If you get into one area, you can roam around the network and get to lots of other pieces of data that perhaps shouldn't get to. And also the fact that as it stands today, almost 25%, actually more than 25% of security buying decisions are made by people outside the security community. It's done by lines of business. This whole issue of business transformation, where marketing directors and HR directors are acquiring IT and making security decisions around that IT and that business process that they're running. And then, of course, we still have the fundamental issue of users. The way that we use technology may have changed fundamentally, but our user behavior hasn't really changed. Now, of course, with cloud, what also happens is that there's much, much more of a focus on the endpoint. We tend to think of the endpoint as a device, but actually it's a user and everything they've got access to and the business processes that they may be involved in. So those are the fundamental factors that remain, and they haven't really changed. But now with business transformation, of course, we all think we go to the cloud, you'll solve a lot of those problems. The cloud is simple, right? The provider will take care of security. I'll make that Amazon's problem. I'll make that Microsoft's problem, or Google. Other cloud choices are available. And also, of course, it's simpler than building your own infrastructure, so that will take care of the issue. But actually, as it turns out, I think in a way, it makes it more complex because we don't have as much visibility over the cloud. Cloud configurations can be horrifyingly difficult to do. And what often happens is that I now have a disparate view of my security. I've got my on-premise security, my data center at my offices, but I also have the cloud now. And it's rare for me to have a single view, a single dashboard of what's going on across those different areas. So, and of course, we're still responsible for compliance. We're still responsible for looking after our customers' data, except now that job has just become a lot more difficult. So, and of course, now to make life a little bit more complicated, we have this big convergence at the moment going on between networking, cloud, and cybersecurity. So what I mean by that is that in the past it was beautiful. We had all our data sitting in a data center. We brought all our users into central locations using MPLS, and we could control traffic to and from the internet and the applications. But now we're in a world where my users are everywhere. They use the internet as a network. They're accessing applications, legacy applications, which we know will remain. As Dom pointed out, mainframes will be there for a very long time to come in lots of different ways. And I need to bring those different things together, where for most businesses, their network provider will be different to their cybersecurity provider, will be different to their cloud provider. So now how do I bring all those different elements together and still be responsible for compliance, still be responsible for securing my customers' data? And I think this is where the real challenge sits for us right now, that these are disparate things that are now coming together, but I still have the responsibility as an organization to look after that data and to secure that data. And I think the evidence of that is around us. I just want to cite a few examples of where this goes wrong. One of the examples is Wise. It's a manufacturer of home security IoT devices, and recently, 2.4 million users' data was compromised, and that translated to about 40 million devices. So on average, people have 10 devices per household, which is probably a little bit lean. I've got more than that, I suspect. And the question is, how did that go wrong? And it really all started with a very good, noble aim. Some developers wanted to gather some usage information and to optimize this, and they put it into Elasticsearch, which seems a sensible thing to do. And that was good, except over time, the credentials disappeared on this Elasticsearch database. So this information is all of a sudden available to everybody on the internet. So really here, this is about developers trying to do something, trying to do their job, perhaps not having the internal resource to do so, using the cloud, but then not taking care of it on a long-term sustainable basis. And just one example, another example is Nitro, which is a tool that gets you, it's a PDF generation, document generation tool, which could be used by everybody, Apple, Google, a lot of people use Nitro as a tool. And what happened here is, again, it was a database that got compromised, weak credentials, and here it was 70 million documents. There's over a terabyte worth of PDFs. Now, this was very confidential documents. Again, this is something that presumably Nitro is much easier to use than it is to do all this production stuff in-house. So I'm using the cloud, I've transformed my business, but I've now exposed my business to a risk that I didn't know before. And then lastly, Docker. Docker is the savior of the world. If you take Docker away from a lot of people, it's probably the one reason why Dominic will not get an Apple M1 machine for a long time, because Docker doesn't work properly. Okay, so of course, Docker is fantastic. It allows us to package our image, our operating system, our application, all the data with that, and it allows me to run it in a very structured, organized way. Except in this case here, researchers from Palo Alto Networks discovered 1,000 Docker registries on the internet, and of which 141 didn't have credentials on. Now, this allowed people to download those Docker images, maybe modify them, upload different versions of it, look at the data and potentially seed some really interesting Docker images on the internet, which actually has very wide-ranging implications. So really here, I guess that the point I'm trying to make is that very often it's not just about the attack surface increasing, which it does greatly with the cloud, but it's also about complexity increasing. And for me, the biggest enemy of security is complexity. And for us, we need to really understand how this technology evolution impacts us, so we don't have one of those 3 case studies that I just shared with you, which were deeply disturbing and distressing for the people involved at the time.
Yeah, indeed. Just going back to the cloud, it's interesting. My sense is that unless I've missed it, I'm not sure, have we seen vulnerabilities in the cloud service providers themselves, or have the problems we've seen been to do with users' use of their cloud services, misconfiguring stuff, misprogramming stuff, and so on?
I mean, Jeff, I think that the problem is more the configuration and use of, okay? I think, the cloud service providers, it's their business to make sure they've got complete, they've got secure infrastructures and so forth. And generally, the cloud providers have been very good and very strong. Yes, occasionally you have some issues with denial of service. There will be some configuration issues, but on the whole, I believe the cloud providers are doing a very good job of securing their own infrastructure. But the reality is they're responsible for security of the cloud, not for security in the cloud. And this is really where the challenge is how we use it, what we do there. And in the reality, when we use the cloud technologies, allows us a lot more freedom, a lot more flexibility. It allows developers to do things that they would have had to go to the IT department before, which they can now do themselves in the cloud, which is where this additional attack surface issue comes in. So it's not just that there's more technology stack to attack, there's actually more people and more processes to attack, because more people are using the cloud than perhaps would have deployed infrastructure in the past.
It's interesting with this sort of evolution of technology point, there is a risk that you sort of sound a bit like kind of King Canute trying to roll back the tide, roll back the waters. You know, look, technology is going to evolve. People's usage of it is going to evolve. What sort of comfort can you give to people? What sort of advice can you give to people who are trying to deal with that tide?
For sure, you know, this is not trying to be anti-cloud person. In fact, I think all we need to do is we just need to apply exactly the same proven models, risk models to the cloud that we do to traditional IT. But the key thing really is this, is that as IT professionals, as security professionals, we need to be an enabler, provide the tools and mechanisms for people to do their job, which then means you've got to manage risk as opposed to unmanaged risk. Where the issue is when you put your head in the sand and assume it's not happening. You know, and there's only two types of companies out there: people that use cloud and people that think they don't use cloud. You know, everybody is using it to some extent. So really the goal here would be to enable people to do it in a structured, well-defined way, in which way you can manage the risk, and not to be a preventer. You know, you need to be an enabler here. That's really the key in my mind.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true. Good stuff. Thanks, Etienne. Really interesting. Obviously, as Charles talked about, part of the idea of climate modeling is to sort of predict and make projections. And that's obviously what Orange Cyber Defence has done. And obviously, some of them come off and some of them don't. So I want to come to Robinson now to talk about this. The idea of sort of predicting where the threat will emerge and focusing resources accordingly. What did you guys predict at the start of 2020, and what are you actually seeing?
Well, one of the things we predicted and that remained true throughout the year is the explosion of ransomware. And in parts because, a ransomware attack is very easy to spot, but also because it's very easy to do and very lucrative to do so. And this has shaped many of the threat landscape as we've seen it. We've seen attackers exploiting technical debt, exploiting easy and widespread vulnerabilities to basically target the low-hanging fruit and the ill-equipped victims for a quick buck. And this is, in fact, perfectly in line with the everyone is a target. And sometimes we see even everything is a target, meaning that some ransomware groups do not target individuals, they target vulnerabilities. One of the, we have observed two groups, one being, one using the Nephilim ransomware and the other using the Maze ransomware. And the common point of all of their victims is that they use Citrix NetScaler technology. And there was a vulnerability this year, or rather last year, that allowed an unauthenticated attacker to obtain clear text credentials on those NetScalers. And in fact, of all the incidents we saw involving those two ransomware, in every case, the threat agents arrived with valid credentials on the NetScaler appliance, and this was the entry point. So one of the predictions we made that wasn't true was the attacks on mobile, OSs, and especially targeting 2FA, which is, in fact, a statement on the strength of the security of mobile OSs. What we didn't predict, and I think is interesting because it's the interaction of many factors, was the resurgence of brute force attacks and the way they became extremely widespread, targeting both, let's say, on-premise instances, but also targeting cloud machines. Some of those cloud machines that we see credentials leaked on the internet, we see that basically the username is test, and I'll let you guess the password, were very probably deployed as part of a test by DevOps team or by admin teams. And the fact that now your test bed and your lab instance is in the cloud and you have to access it remotely means that most everybody can access it remotely. And so your throwaway box is now a tool that can be used by attacker as the first point of interaction between them and their victims. So again, in many incidents we've handled this year, this was a commonality that we found the IP address and the username of the machines that we see as used by the attacker in public list of shared credentials for compromised machines.
So when you're talking about brute force attacks there, are you talking about, just to be clear, password guessing? I didn't think that worked anymore. I thought there were processes in place to stop you having too many guesses. So maybe I'm being stupid about it.
Well, yes, but going back to the legacy factors, those processes aren't in place when you have one single Windows machine exposed to the internet. Also, I didn't think that works in 2020 was my reaction when Emotet was spread using Word documents with macros embedded. So we have to keep an open mind and not say that history tends to repeat itself, but be persuaded that history will repeat itself because we tend to make the same mistakes. And this is something independent of technology.
It's interesting, the mobile threat that you've talked about. I find that interesting because we talked elsewhere in this session about complexity, and complexity builds on complexity and introduces vulnerabilities. You know, the mobile space has always struck me as very complex. You know, you have device manufacturers, you've got the software makers who put the software on the device, you've got the app makers. You know, it strikes me as a very complex ecosystem, and from what I thought, ripe for kind of exploitation. Are there reasons you think that that mobiles have managed to not be quite as vulnerable as static or desktop environments?
Well, I think Dominic stressed out one of those reasons is that the mobile OSs have made a choice of preventing any code that is not vetted to run on devices. That means that, yes, you can have a case of an app publisher that is compromised and pushing out malicious apps onto a store, but not everyone can run code on a machine or can run code, can build an app that can be executed by the majority of the users. This is something that Windows is trying to address in a way with smart screen and other technologies that say, well, this application, we haven't seen it on many devices, so are you really sure you want to run it? But it is not the same as forcing every application to be signed, and so basically to be published by someone we at least know, and that we can revoke the right of execution on all devices with one click of a button. So it is, yes, a closed ecosystem, but safer in many ways because of it.
Yeah. No, interesting. Just going back to the ransomware point, ransomware field and an issue. Obviously, one of the big trends has been ransomware combined with data leaks as a sort of, extortion tactic. Again, was that something that you predicted? And I'd be quite interested to see how you see that evolving. Is that just ongoing, or the evolutions you can see in the future for that?
Well, ransomware is a very weird bug to examine as an entomologist, because ransomware was created as a way for attackers to monetize machines they couldn't monetize otherwise. So when you have compromised a machine belonging to not a corporation, but some guy who has like his vacation photos on them, what do you do with it? And you had the option to send spam from it, and then ISPs prevented you to send mail from your IP address, and then also mail server blacklisted everyone that wasn't a server. So then you could DDoS from it, from the compromised machine. But this was mitigated in many ways. So ransomware was born as a way to basically monetize a machine that only has value for its owner. It has moved to target not individuals, but corporations. I guess because attackers are lazy, and instead of going and stealing banking data or credit card data, or going to the trouble of, once you have compromised the machine, social engineering someone to have him do a banking transaction, it's way easier to just get domain admin and encrypt everything. Companies reacted by doing what not even security professionals, but IT professionals have told them for 20 years, which is back up your data, and also know how to restore it. And so I guess, once the majority or a sufficient percentage of potential corporate victims had solid backup and restore strategies in place, attackers with ransomware were left with a choice. Either we are not lazy again and start locating backup solution and systematically destroying them, which they do, or now we have to threaten them another way and saying, yes, of course you restored, but still now do pay us because we will threaten your reputation. But this is many ways trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, because ransomware was not designed to target corporations. How will it evolve then is a very, very good question. I mean, maybe they will try to get more persistence by doing this kind of BIOS UEFI persistent things that have been documented for 10 years and attackers, well, state-level attackers have been doing. Maybe this will be the last thing, like you have to physically throw the machine. It's up to anyone's guess.
Okay. And frankly, from a climate change perspective, raises a recycling nightmare if we start to throw away all that kit and leave it to dissolve.
Think of the rare metals, yeah.
In landfill, yeah. Interesting stuff. I'm just going to go back to Charles just briefly. I wonder, I mean, it's an interesting model, this, and the sort of climate comparisons are interesting. How do you see organizations being able to apply this, you know, on a practical level? How do you think they can fit it into their day-to-day or year-to-year practices?
If I'm particularly interested in the systemic things, you know, I think the technical factors we've got some control over, and we must exercise that control clearly over the domains that, you know, are manifestly ours. But I don't see those technical controls really shifting the dial. I really, whenever I get a chance to talk to people, I call on them to examine the systemic factors that we can influence through our behavior, and start applying themselves to those. And I think there's a few simple examples of where that can happen. The one very clear one is with policy and regulation. You know, I think businesses should be leading there in terms of shaping policy, engaging with governments. I think another one is with simple the security leadership gap. You know, I think we live in an industry that's led by a vendor. You know, we're a vendor, we like to lead, obviously, but we shouldn't be on our own in front. You know, I think we need to see more of the victims, the clients, the consumers stepping out ahead to plot a course forward. And for this year, I would say the theme for me in terms of those systemic factors has been what we call in our model interdependence, which is this idea that which is really illustrated so nicely through the COVID crisis. You know, that I wear a mask to protect you and you wear a mask to protect me. It's this idea that we need to look at our risk models not only in terms of what the impact on us as a business or us on a consumer will be acutely in the short term, but on what the downstream impacts will be of the decisions that we make. When a breach happens, you know, what runs down when we introduce new technologies, what the impact of that will be. I really think that we need to collectively hold each other a bit more responsible and hold ourselves more responsible for the impact that we as businesses have on the collective.
Interesting stuff. Thanks, Charles. I'm going to come to each of the speakers one by one. Just want to ask what your one thing you would recommend to CISOs who are here today when they go back to the office. What's the one thing you would recommend that they do or think about? Let's go to you first, Dominic, if that's okay.
Sure. I'm always cautious of making these recommendations because it's much easier said than done. But I think, you know, going back to the points I was making, I think it's that you can fundamentally shift the stuff area you expose, but it's not going to happen automatically, and you're not going to find it in best practice. So it's to try and find the opportunities for making sort of radical shifts to your security surface area that might remove classes of vulnerability. You know, stop being as individual vulnerabilities, but rather classes of vulnerabilities. How do you make those go away?
Interesting stuff. Thanks. Nicola, can I come to you next? What's your one takeaway for CISOs?
I think I will recommend to look for allies. I mean, you can't deal with the cybersecurity alone. You need to have allies. It can be at the business department, the finance department, legal teams. Everyone, once they are enlightened about the question of cybersecurity, they will support that action because it's a continuity, the fact that profitability of the company. So look for allies, take the time to explain the mission, the perimeter, what you have involved in, and then it will be easier at the end.
Good stuff. Useful advice. Robinson, can I come to you next? What would be your tip or takeaway?
Sure. My takeaway would be very wary of technical debt. It is something that will end up like that you will pay remediating an incident on just one lump sum, and we are all increasing it every day by going for the next shiny new things and not caring about what is there already.
Good stuff. Great advice. And Etienne, you lastly, what will be your takeaway?
Jeff, for me, I think my takeaway will be about prioritization. There's more things and things to do than we have time or resource for. But to do that, I think it's really important to be aligned more closely with the business. So in other words, thinking about the things that's keeping your CEO and CFO at work at night, then try to translate that back into technical risk factors, which allows you to focus on the issues that really matter. And you know, that's if I have to say one thing, because I think very often I see people focusing on the things that Robertson was talking about, you know, the next technical thing, the next shiny thing, especially in industry that's very independent led, and not focus on the real business issues and the things that actually could affect the business in a very real way.
Sage advice from Etienne. Thank you to all our panelists, Etienne, Dominic, Robinson, Charles, and Nicola. That's it for this panel, but you may have some burning questions about the climate model. You may have some burning questions about any of the issues raised in the panel. So we're going to be doing a Q&A with our panelists. That's going to be here at midday GMT or 1 o'clock Central European time. There's a feedback form. Please remember to fill it in before you leave, and you can enter the draw to win a signed copy of my book, crime.com, which your feedback is very important to people who host these events to make them better for next time. The next session is going to be starting in a few minutes' time. That's going to be 10:15 GMT UK time or 11:15 European time. That's going to feature challenges and predictions from the country's viewpoint. These are 30-minute tactical presentations from individual Orange cyber defense countries. Obviously have a big presence across Europe, so you can pick your preference, but be mindful these talks are sometimes in local language. So if you don't speak the language, you won't get much out of the presentations, so do pick your own language. There's also a talk from a global perspective, which is going to be in English, that's dedicated to international clients of Orange Cyber Defense and followers. And you can access the CISO priorities anytime. These are a selection of on-demand presentations to pinpoint the CISO's top critical issues and OCD's perspective on how to best manage them. Thanks for joining us for this panel. Look forward to seeing you a bit later on for the Q&A, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks very much.